So I want us to shift our attention very quickly to manslaughter as covered under Section 202 and 205 of the Penal Code. So what is manslaughter? Manslaughter is the unlawful killing of another person without malice aforethought. Now, there are core elements when it comes to manslaughter, so that the prosecution must prove a number of things. The prosecution must prove the death of a person occurred. They must prove death was caused by the accused. They must prove it was caused through an unlawful act or omission. They must prove that death occurred within a year and a day, and that there was absence of malice aforethought. Now, remember, manslaughter is a residual offense to murder, meaning if murder is not fully proved, conviction may still be manslaughter. Now, there is a distinction between murder and manslaughter. You see, when it comes to death, it is both required in murder and manslaughter. When it comes to unlawful act, it is required in both murder and manslaughter. But when it comes to malice aforethought is required for murder, but it is not required for manslaughter. If you look at the case of Wycliffe Oluoch Odhiambo versus Republic, the facts of this particular case were that the accused stabbed the deceased, causing death, but evidence of malice aforethought was unclear. And so the issue in this particular case was whether absence of proof of malice aforethought reduces murder to manslaughter. And the rule is that where killing is proved, but malice aforethought is doubtful, conviction becomes manslaughter. And the application of this particular case was that the court accepted accused caused death, but intention to kill was not established clearly. So the conclusion of this particular case was that the murder conviction was substituted with manslaughter. Now, the legal principle that I want you to always remember is that the absence of malice aforethought amounts to manslaughter. Now, I want us to look at the actus reus of manslaughter. Now, the first actus reus when it comes to manslaughter is the unlawful act causing death, so that the act must be unlawful, the act must be voluntary, the act must be dangerous, and the act must cause death. If you look at the case of Rex versus Jeremiah Singine, the facts of this particular case were that two people fought immediately after quarreling without weapons. And so one of them died. And the issue was whether death from a spontaneous fight amounts to murder. And the rule is that where combat occurs without unfair advantage or without weapons, resulting death becomes manslaughter. And the application of this particular case was that the fight was mutual and spontaneous. So the conclusion of this case was that the offense amounted to manslaughter. So the legal principle you must always remember is that sudden fights without weapons usually amount to manslaughter. Now, another element, actus reus element, when it comes to manslaughter is a dangerous act. And here we apply the objective test, and that is the test of a reasonable person. So that danger is judged using the test of a reasonable man. So that it is not whether the accused foresaw the danger. It is what a reasonable person in the shoes of the accused will have foreseen. And here we have the case of Joash Wandanda Okwiri versus Republic. And the facts of this particular case were that the accused brutally assaulted the deceased, causing severe injuries and death. And the issue in this particular case was whether assault qualified as a dangerous unlawful act. And the rule is that the act is dangerous if a reasonable person recognizes the risk of harm. And the application of this particular case was that the assault involved broken ribs, it involved cuts, and it involved internal bleeding. And so the conclusion of this case was that the act was dangerous and manslaughter was actually established. So the legal principle you must always remember is that danger is assessed objectively using the test of a reasonable man. Another thing when it comes to the actor's rear in manslaughter is that minor assault is not enough. So that minor assault alone cannot support manslaughter unless it is reasonably dangerous. If you look at the case of Rex versus Petro Magongo, son of Katwo, the facts of this particular case were that the accused pushed a child into a river. So the child later died from pneumonia due to illness. And the issue in this particular case was whether minor assault causing death due to victim's weakness amounts to murder. And the rule is that minor assault without knowledge of vulnerability reduces liability. And the application of this case was that the accused was unaware that the child had an infirmity. And so the conclusion of this case was that the conviction was reduced to manslaughter. So the legal principle you must always remember is that the thin skull rule is limited where vulnerability is unknown. Another thing when it comes to the actor's rules in manslaughter is that the proof of death is actually required. So that death must be medically or factually established. If you look at the case of Rex versus Cuban Malik, the facts of this particular case were that one accused denied participating in a fatal assault, but evidence linked him indirectly. And so the issue was whether indirect involvement can support conviction. And the rule is that participation may be inferred from surrounding circumstances. And the application of this particular case was that the evidence sufficiently connected the accused. And the conclusion was that the conviction was actually upheld. And so the legal principle you must always remember is that circumstantial involvement is sufficient if it is strong. Now, I want us to look at the mens rea of manslaughter. Now, the mens rea here is less blameworthy mental state than in murder. And it includes intention, it includes knowledge, it includes negligence, and it also includes recklessness. Now, there are mitigating circumstances that can reduce murder to manslaughter, and we've talked about this. We've talked about provocation, intoxication, mistake, and self-defense. If you look at the case of Rex versus Zakayo Luabijao, the facts of this particular case were that the trial court rejected defense in murder trial, and the issue was whether court must still consider manslaughter. And the rule is that courts must consider manslaughter where evidence supports it. And the application of this case was that evidence suggested reduced culpability was possible. And so the conclusion of the case was that the courts were obligated to consider manslaughter alternative. So the legal principle is that the trial court must evaluate lesser offenses options. Now let's look at the first mens rea in manslaughter, and that is the intention to commit a dangerous act. Now, even without intent to kill, liability still exists. If you look at the case of DPP versus Newberry, the facts of this particular case were that the accused pushed an object off the bridge, killing a train guard. And so the issue was whether intention to kill is required for manslaughter. And the rule is that intentional unlawful dangerous act causing death amounts to manslaughter. And the application of this case was that throwing an object was actually a dangerous act. And the conclusion of this case was that the conviction was actually upheld. So the legal principle you must always remember is that intent to perform dangerous act is actually enough when it comes to manslaughter. Another mens rea element in manslaughter is knowledge. So here, transferred risk liability applies. If you look at the case of Rex versus Mugambo bin Kwenyema, the facts of this particular case were that the accused shot at one person but accidentally killed another person. And the issue was whether the liability transfers to an intended victim. And the rule is that knowledge of danger to human life is sufficient for manslaughter. And the application of this particular case was that shooting carried obvious risk that the accused should have been aware of. And the conclusion of this particular case was that the accused was guilty of manslaughter. So the legal principle you must always remember is that transferred malice applies in manslaughter. We also have another mens rea element in manslaughter called recklessness. This is simply acting despite awareness of risk. If you look at the case of Gideon Miano versus Republic, the facts of this particular case were that a police officer shot a fleeing suspect without warning, and the issue was whether conduct by the police officer amounted to recklessness. And the rule is that shooting without warning shows reckless disregard for human life. And the application of this case was that the officer aimed and fired unnecessarily. And the conclusion of this case was that the officer was convicted of manslaughter. So the legal principle you must always remember is that reckless police shooting amounts to manslaughter. Another mens rea element when it comes to manslaughter is negligence. Now, this is simply failure to exercise reasonable care. It is recognized under Section 202.2 of the Penal Code. If you look at the case of Rex versus Obao, son of Olukamba, the facts of this particular case were that a hunter threw a spear at an antelope before it passed the line of hunters. Unfortunately, he struck his colleague. And so the issue was whether careless hunting conduct amounts to manslaughter. And the rule is that gross negligence causing death actually amounts to manslaughter. And so the application of this particular case was that the accused acted prematurely and dangerously. And so the conclusion of this case was that the conviction was upheld, but the sentence was reduced. So the legal principle we must always remember is that consent to risk reduces gravity, but it does not reduce liability. So when it comes to manslaughter, there is also the idea of suicide pacts, and this is covered under Section 209 of the Penal Code. And so the definition of suicide pacts is simply an agreement between persons that they all will die, and then one of them executes the killings. And the executor also intends to die. And so the result is that if the executor does not die, then he is guilty of manslaughter, he is not guilty of murder. And the reason for that is because of reduced moral blameworthiness. So that the mens rea required is the settled intention to die together. So what is the penalty for manslaughter? You see, the penalty for manslaughter is a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. But the sentence depends on provocation, it depends on circumstances, it depends on a degree of violence, and it also depends on the offender conduct. If you look at the case of Gideon Kenga Maita versus Republic, the facts of this particular case were that the accused stabbed his brother after insults and provocation. And so the issue was whether life imprisonment was appropriate. And the rule is that sentence must reflect the circumstances. And the application of this case was that the provocation reduced culpability. And the conclusion of this case was that the sentence was reduced from life imprisonment to 5 years imprisonment. So the legal principle we must always remember is that provocation significantly reduces the sentence. Now, when it comes to manslaughter, there is also the important principle of the burden of proof, so that the burden of proof lies entirely on the prosecution, so that the accused has no duty to prove innocence. If you look at the case of Kyoko versus Republic, the facts of this particular case were that the trial court suggested accused conduct was inconsistent with innocence. And so the issue was whether the court shifted the burden of proof. And the rule is that the burden of proof is always on the prosecution. And the application was that the trial court improperly shifted the burden of proof. So the conclusion was that the appellate court had to correct that particular error. So the legal principle you must always remember is that any shift of the burden of proof to the accused amounts to a legal error. Now, I want to give you a quick exam summary of what we've covered. And I want you to remember that to prove manslaughter, the prosecution must show that death occurred, that the accused caused the death, that there was an act or omission which was unlawful, that the act was objectively dangerous, and that there was no malice aforethought. And the mens rea may be recklessness, it may be negligence, it may be knowledge, it may be intention. And the mitigating factors are provocation, intoxication, and also mistake. So that is all I have as far as manslaughter is concerned. If it is your first time here, make sure to follow this channel and to subscribe for more legal lessons.